There's one huge mistake that is so easy to make on race day, and this very mistake actually made me miss my 10-mile goal by over 15 minutes. When I realised what it was and changed it, I actually claimed all of that time back and much more. So we'll start with the simple things to avoid, and then we'll get to that one big mistake. But first, let me give you a little bit of context. When I signed up for my first race, I set up a plan to cross the finish line on a local 10-miler. Training went perfectly fine, but I ran into some issues on race day. I am so sorry about that horrendous pun. The first of which was my breakfast. If I remember correctly, it was genuinely a bucket full of porridge with 2 bananas and nearly half a tub of that Biscoff spread. Take one guess of how that ended up. All over the floor. I'm aware that's fairly straightforward, but you'd be surprised the amount of times I've nearly done it myself. Even now, I find it hard to hold back the urge to really cram some energy in before a race day. I'm all for fueling your body, but this is not the way. Now, you might have heard of carb loading. This is the process of replenishing the energy in your muscles with carbs as you near the race. It's not a myth, and it definitely does work. Don't worry, bread is not gonna kill you. So yeah, I'd recommend carb loading, but not in the way that I did. Just eat your regular diet that's been working through your training, but 3 days prior to race day, start shifting your ratios of macros so you're eating more carbs rather than excessive amounts of protein or fat. Alright, moving on to yet another problem I had to face, and no, we're not the big one yet, we will get there shortly, not performing a deload. If I remember correctly, I actually attempted a 5k PB on Friday and the race was on Sunday. I know this whole scenario just gets worse and worse. By the way, if you are struggling with any problems at all in running, like I was back in the day, I've actually made a free 14-day training that you can pick up. It's really solid info, and again, it's completely free. I'll leave the link in the description. Anyways, back on track. The 5k attempt was obviously a bad idea. This is your sign to embrace the deload. So how should we set one up? Start 2 weeks out from the event, and we're just going to cut the running volume that we've currently been training in half. As we get into race week, we're going to just take another half of the volume again. This is the simplest way to do a one-size-fits-all race taper. Just remember your carb load on 3 days prior and don't eat a full tub of Biscoff. Okay, fine, I'll let the cat out the bag. The biggest thing to avoid before race day is actually really simple. Don't change anything. When I did my first race, I literally bought some new shoes for the race specifically. While they might have been great and they might have been quick shoes, I almost immediately got blisters after running 2 or 3 miles in, and I could feel that for pretty much the whole race. Your body is great at adapting. It gets really efficient at the setup that you've used through training, so when you slip on some new Alpha Flies on race day, probably about as useful as sticking a pole in the front wheel of your bike. This whole concept applies to nutrition as well. If you're doing a longer run and you've been having an energy gel every 30 minutes, why all of a sudden for race day have one every 3 hours? This is such a simple tip, but it's one that's cost me a lot of time and pain in the past. Don't be like beginner me, join the 14-day free training in the description and learn a whole load more about running. I'll see you in the next one.